Welcome, I'm Mike Krause, Vice President of Operations at the Independence Institute, filling in for John Caldera. Sadly, we had to have an intervention for John, and he has been involuntarily committed to a really low-rent sex addiction clinic. We wish him the best. Stay tuned a little later in the show, and we're going to talk about some criminal justice bills in the legislature, but for now, we got Dave Kopel at the table. Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
All right, Dave, this is very cool. Your dad, Jerry Kopel, passed away about 2 years ago, correct?
3 years.
3 years ago, and he served in the Colorado State Legislature for a long time. This was pre-term limits. And after the legislature, he was a prolific writer about legislative activity in Colorado politics. And you have written a book about his writing. Is that right?
Yes. He was a state representative from Denver for 22 years, assistant minority leader, chair of the Judiciary Committee, and then for 20 years after he retired, he wrote a weekly column for the Colorado Statesman, our state's weekly political newspaper, providing bipartisan advice on how to be a good legislator. And so I took his columns and revised them, smoothed them together, and turned them into a book. So that everybody can now learn how to be a good state legislator.
Okay, that's the theme, right? How to be a good state legislator.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about the being left wing or right wing. It's about being effective, about serving your constituents, and of course, we've already given it to its core audience.
Legislators?
Yes. State Senate President Bill Cadman and former State Senate President Morgan Carroll wrote a joint letter, and that was distributed to all the current 100 state legislators, along with a free copy of this book. But it's also a book that's useful for sort of anyone who's interested in Colorado politics, about what makes somebody effective. It's got tips on how to run a campaign, how to get your bill out of committee. So if you follow what goes on in the legislature and want to understand it better and want to see how your legislator's doing, it's a good guide also for the citizen who wants to follow state government intelligently.
So this isn't just necessarily a bill about how to not damage liberty too terribly badly when you're in the legislature. It's about the mechanics of being in the legislature, because it's tricky, right? I mean, if you're a rookie lawmaker and you get elected, and since we have term limits, people only serve a couple of terms in the House and the Senate, you got to go in, you got a steep learning curve ahead of you. I mean, from day one when you hit the floor, because you're seeing bills right off the bat.
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons we gave it out in the first week of the legislative session, so that to help those rookies, because you see things pretty quickly divide in the legislature. One of the things that it explains is people get a first impression of you quickly. So if the first speech you give on the floor of the House is some intelligent, eloquent thing which really adds to the discussion, you're on your way to a good reputation. And on the other hand, if you come up in your first speech as, well, I agree too, and you repeat things that everyone else has said, you're well on the way to people thinking you're kind of a dolt, and it can take years to overcome that impression.
In fact, that's funny you would say that, because I've actually had lawmakers tell me that depending on which side of the aisle you're sitting on, that when you see a certain lawmaker from the other side of the aisle heading towards the mic, you either go, oh, geez, this guy's going to destroy our argument, or you go, yes, please bring this guy on. We want him up there talking about this bill, because he's going to sound like a fool. And so hopefully the book might help some people avoid being the fool end at some point in their career.
Exactly, and it's also about how to move your bills through a committee. And, and one of the important things is we have, especially in a divided legislature, what if you're in the minority party? Whereas my dad explains, if just the way wolves will, the mommy wolf and daddy wolf will like find a rabbit and not kill it, but they'll take it back to the den and bring it to the cubs so the cubs can learn how to kill for themselves. That's what the majority party does with minority party bills, is they train their new majority party members in how to kill things by, kill this minority legislator's bill. So when you're in the minority and you're up against that, how do you get around that? How can you pass a bill as a minority member?
All right, well, let's talk about the legislature, because when your dad served, I mean, it was a different era, I would say, not just necessarily in Colorado, but in the legislature itself. And tell me if I'm wrong here, that today the philosophical divide between the two parties is much wider than it would have been in your dad's era. Is that a fair statement, that the Democrats are further to the left on the progressive spectrum, and the Republicans have gone further to the right on the Tea Party spectrum. Is that a fair assessment?
Sure, there are many fewer conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans, but there's also a mechanical change. Is when my dad first set foot in the legislature in 1965, and he'd actually been a bill draftsman with the Attorney General's office before that, so he knew his way around. But in those days, you didn't have offices unless you were, say, majority leader. So your office was the desk on the floor of the House, and that was it. So it's more like being in high school where everybody's got to get along all the time because you're so physically close. And now that people are dispersed into offices, there's less opportunity to get to know somebody and have to get along. One of the things he advises is, to the extent when you're choosing your seat, sit on the edge. Try to sit on so that you're next to members of the other party. And he talks about how he did that, and he built friendships around that, and got a lot of intelligence from the Republicans he sat next to. Not that he would get their votes, but he'd learn a lot about what was going on, and they would share some stuff. So that's one thing that citizens can also look to in their legislators is this a guy who is always standing up and denouncing the other party as they're all evil, bad people, or is he the guy who, even though he's partisan, has friendships across the aisle?
So what do you think what did your dad think of term limits once they came into effect? Because they weren't around, because he served for over 20 years, right?
Oh, that's right. He thought they were terrible.
He thought they were a bad idea.
Because it takes away experience, because now the most experienced guy in any body has served there 8 years, which is a lot, but there's still lots of things to learn. And after 4 or 5 years in the legislature, you know a lot of things, but you don't necessarily know what you don't know yet. So one of the things he advises is find a mentor. Not the parties will put the legislative leadership will put people, a junior legislator together with a mentor. But he says, go beyond that. Go get somebody who's retired, somebody who can tell you what it was like in the 90s or before. You need to. There's such a lack of that social capital of knowledge these days. So you've got to be the most effective legislator, go out and seek that on your own.
Let's talk about Congresswoman Diana DeGette wrote a foreword for this book. Which is really interesting. Your dad was a Democrat. Tell me the relationship between him and Diana DeGette, because I find it interesting that she wrote the foreword for this.
Well, he was, in a way, the beginning of her political career. In his last 2 campaigns, in 1988 and 1990, she was his campaign treasurer. And then after 92, he retired in 92, and so she ran for his seat, and with his blessing and endorsement. And she talks about how he helped her introduce her first bill, and she was wondering, what is that bill? Oh, Jerry Kopel's calling, and he's going to tell me what my first bill should be. Is this going to be some huge environmental thing or some big consumer reform? And it was, no, it's do the reviser's statute, which is where you go through the Colorado revised statutes and you sponsor the bill that takes out obsolete language. And she was like, at first, oh, this is not as exciting as what I wanted to do.
This ain't sexy.
But it's important because you want the laws to be coherent and comprehensible so that citizens can read them and obey them. And also, she was in the minority at the time. Well, if you're in the minority and you sponsor the megalithic, gigantic Enviro bill, that can be very exciting for you to do, but it's not going to pass if you're in the minority and pushing that. But if you're the minority member who comes in, hey, this is a constructive, nonpartisan thing that needs to get done, the majority will often go along with that, and then you've learned how to pass your first bill. And one of the things he explains is 80% or more of what's in the legislature is not partisan. You know, the stuff that's in the newspapers, that's the most exciting thing that is partisan. But a lot of the time, 80% of what the legislature does isn't partisan, and that's where the legislator who has the friends on the other side, who knows the rules, who knows the statutes, who knows what he's talking about, who can explain his own bill rather than saying, oh, go ask the lobbyist. I'm not exactly sure what's in my bill. I haven't read it. The ones who do their work are the ones who get bills passed in that large nonpartisan zone that exists.
Fantastic. Decades and decades of Colorado political wisdom in one book.
And also lots of Colorado political history
And
in here
history
too.
of, because your dad left an imprint on the history of the state.
Right, and there's, besides the stuff he talks about directly from his experience in the 60s or 70s or 80s, there's also, he wrote a lot of Colorado political history. So it's got the story of statehood and the incredible intrigues going on in the Andrew Johnson and U.S. Grant administration, and Senator Chafee versus Senator Teller, and our very tortuous path to statehood, including our first out of the box U.S. representative election, which was disputed and it ended up going to the House of Representatives to be decided.
Excellent. Rules for state legislators. If you want to be a state legislator, you want to understand the legislature better, go grab the book. Dave.
And it's at the Tattered Cover.
At the Tattered Cover bookstore?
And on Amazon in electronic format.
On Kindle?
Yes.
Fantastic. Dave Kopel, Independence Institute Research Director, thanks so much.
Thank you.